From the vast forests of Canada comes pulp to make newsprint for giant metropolitan presses. In the past decade, the circulation of these papers reached a point where new forest limits had to be obtained to supply enough pulpwood for newsprint. Far-sighted engineers of the Ontario Paper Company selected the region of northern Quebec extending back from Bay Como on the north shore of the lower St. Lawrence. By 1936, plans were well underway at the head office in Thorold, Ontario.
Hello?
Colonel McCormick is calling, Mr. Schmoen.
Hello, Colonel McCormick.
How long will it take you to construct Bay Como?
How long to construct Bay Como? Well, Colonel, you know that it is located in one of the most isolated districts on this continent. Because of the transportation difficulties, length and rigor of the winters, and exposure to heavy seas, it will be one of the most difficult construction projects ever attempted. However, I believe the project can be completed in 2 years.
Go ahead, then.
Good. Please call in the executive staff.
I know you are pleased that at last the decision to go ahead has been given. But please remember that it is an opportunity and a responsibility that comes to few men to spend $15 to $20 million of private capital. Just a few words to explain our objectives. First, this is not to be a project designed by engineers and revamped to make it function efficiently by operators. This project is to be designed and constructed through the cooperation of our operating and technical men, our engineers, and our construction departments, each to have an equal say. Second, we must not exceed our budget. This is to be a planned project. We do not want to have any of the confusion resulting from lack of foresight and then the need to bull through afterwards. Third, the comfort and happiness of our employees is to receive the most careful consideration and planning. It is our wish that Bay Como will arise out of the rocks and wilderness, a modern and beautiful city with excellent hospitals, schools, churches, and recreation facilities. Fourth, the power plant will be the most hazardous part of the project. The pipeline will be the largest in the world, and the unstable conditions of the hill carrying the penstock must receive careful engineering consideration. Fifth, the woods operations present a number of difficult problems. We'll start to prepare the English River watershed to supply our initial needs. Sixth, we will select the best and most modern paper mill equipment, including the fastest wide newsprint paper machine in the world, to produce quality newsprint at low cost. Now for the final objective. We must not disappoint Colonel McCormick, and I have complete confidence in our organization to produce an outstanding job. Remember at all times this cardinal principle. The Chicago Tribune and the New York Daily News must have the finest quality newsprint that can be produced. Bay Como must be the most modern, low-cost mill in the world.
On foot through the lonely green forest and by air over it, the men of the North Shore carefully charted their course. Their preliminary work knew no seasons. Dog teams carried supplies across the frozen snows. Ski planes brought men and machines into the bush, the only way to reach Bay Como for 5 months of the year. After months of intensive survey and design work, the blueprint for an industry and city in the forest was complete. Construction began immediately. Cribs for the wharf were launched into the water. Skilled divers guided them to the bottom of the bay. Gradually, a wharf stretched out to meet incoming ships loaded with materials and equipment, workmen, food, and 1,000 articles needed for the young community. Starting from the water's edge, giant bulldozers gouged roads back into the virgin forest. Thousands of cubic yards of rock were blasted and scooped away as the roads pushed forward. Space was cleared for the camps, the huge mill, and the town site homes. Early in the 1920s, work had begun on the Outard Falls power development. By 1928, a huge concrete barrier had been completed to hold back the waters of the Outard River to ensure a reliable and steady supply of water for the turbines. 1.25 million gallons will be required every minute. To carry water from the dam to the powerhouse, the engineers decided on a wood stave penstock supported on concrete piers. This penstock is the largest of its kind ever built. It is 18 feet in diameter. The penstock follows the contours of the ground to the powerhouse. A huge surge tank, 65 feet in diameter and 160 feet high, is provided to smooth out the surges when a turbine is shut down. This tank is built over the pipeline on the 200-foot drop to the powerhouse. The water hurls down through 14-foot penstalks to the power station below. There, two 35,000 horsepower turbines transform the power of the rushing water to electrical power for the paper mill and for the town itself. Power is stepped up to 66,000 volts for transmission to the Baie-Comeau substation 14 miles away. At the substation, 3 banks of transformers reduce the voltage of the current for electric boilers and low voltage motors in the mill. While the construction gang were erecting power facilities on the Outard River, more men were constructing buildings for the barking drums, the grinders, digesters, paper machines, and storage sheds. Huge rock crushers were set up on the site, and soon the concrete began to pour into the forms that an army of carpenters had set up. Even before the concrete was dry, they were back on the job, adding more formwork for columns and beams. Gradually, the buildings took shape, and the plant engineers prepared to put the heavy machinery into place. The barking drums were so big that the buildings had to be built around them. Then the steel workers moved in and the skeletons of buildings began to rise. Prefabricated sections were hoisted and riveters fastened them together. Fittings and equipment had arrived by then. Well covered with tarpaulins, they wait until the steelwork in the walls are complete. At the same time, miles of flumes were being rushed to completion, till finally the great modern newsprint mill stood complete and ready to work. With an eye to future development, expert lumbermen and cruisers go into the bush country to survey the quantity and quality of the wood and to plan their cutting schedule for the year. Soon the ring of axes and saws biting into the soft wood re-echoes through the forest. The pulpwood harvest is on. Instead of awkward two-man crosscut saws, the men use a small handy Swede saw. Branches are trimmed and the logs are cut to 4-foot lengths. Afterward, they're piled ready for the spring drive. In the spring, the floodwaters rush the logs downstream out of the forest to the mill. On they go, swirling down broad rivers, tumbling through racing white waters, across lakes, and along miles of man-made sluiceways. Where gravity can no longer bring the wood to the mill, jack ladders raise the logs up over the height of land into the flumes and down to the mill. At last the logs reach the last conveyor into the mill, and they're carried into the barking drums. As the barking drums revolve, the logs tumble against the sides and against each other until all the bark has been removed. A continuous stream of water plays on the logs as they're thrown about, loosening and peeling off the bark. The logs required for processing are taken into the mill. The others are stored in huge piles in the yard from which they will be taken during the winter months. A year's supply of 90,000 cords of wood is in these piles. The logs are now barked and slide out onto a sorting conveyor belt where the dirty logs are recirculated through the barking drums. The accepted logs go on to the next process. In the grinder room, the logs drop off the conveyor belt into the storage piles preparatory to being fed into the grinder magazines. Wearing steel safety boots and metal guards on his shins to protect himself from the heavy logs, a wood puller arranges the logs in the magazine at the top of the hydraulic grinders. Inside the grinder, a large revolving grindstone grinds the wood into pulp under a shower of water. The resulting pulp is discharged from the bottom of the grinder at about 2% consistency. From the grinders, the pulp passes through coarse screens, then fine screens, and finally through deckers, which thicken the pulp for storage. In the sulfite mill, before the chemical pulp is manufactured, acid must be made. Here, sulfur is burned to produce sulfur dioxide. This gas is cooled before it is pumped up into the acid towers where the acid is made. Other logs from the great storage piles are conveyed into the chipper. From the chipper, they pass out onto the chip screens to be sorted so that only those of uniform size are sent to the digester. On conveyor belts, the chips go to the top of the digester. They are blown into the digester and packed by means of a jet of steam. Later, the cover is clamped on, then acid and steam are applied. After a few hours cooking, all encrusting materials are dissolved, leaving only the cellulose pulp. The temperature and pressure have to be accurately controlled in this process because the entire contents of the digester, 13 tons of pulp, can be spoiled through improper control. The finished pulp is blown from the bottom of the digester by steam pressure into the blow pit. There the acid is washed off the pulp with a strong jet of water. The sulfite pulp, like the groundwood, is screened and thickened for storage. Then the two pulps, groundwood and sulfite, are brought together in the correct proportion, and their consistency is regulated before the mixture goes into the bird screens. Now the pulp is ready for the actual process of paper making. For about 1.5 seconds, the sheet of paper is on the 100-foot foudrinier wire section, and the water drains through the wire into the pit below. Oscillating suction boxes draw off additional water. The wire section ends at the suction couch roll where still more water is drawn off, and the sheet of paper now jumps across a gap to the wet felt. Now the paper enters the suction press section. Here a heavy top press roll squeezes water out, which is drawn through the perforated bottom press roll. The sheet is traveling at over 1,400 feet a minute. The paper enters the dryer section where it passes around steam-filled polished dryers and the final drying of the sheet takes place. Here too the steam pressure and various other factors are closely watched as the paper rolls on its way. Finally, the paper reaches the calendar stack where it is ironed by heavy steel rolls and wound on a reel. The entire process of forming, drying, ironing, and reeling has taken only 15 seconds on these giant machines. The roll of paper, over 20 feet wide, is hoisted to the winder from the reel. As the paper is rewound, it is cut to the width desired by the publisher. The finished newsprint is wrapped in a heavy wrapping paper. Specifications of weight, size, and date made are pasted on the roll, and it is conveyed to the huge storage shed which will hold nearly 50,000 tons of newsprint. From this shed, the paper is hauled by diesel locomotive to the wharf, where it is loaded on the company's ships, thence to be sailed down the St. Lawrence, through the Straits, and along the coast to New York and the huge presses of the Daily News. Beautiful Bay Como. Little did men realize that in the space of a few years, the world's most modern and efficient newsprint mill would rise up out of the wilderness. Little did they realize that there would be a community of men and women and children earning their daily bread in the same manner as those in the turbulent cities. The Bay Como of today is a far cry from that of just a few years ago, for then no one heard the tumbling waters of Outard Falls. No one lived on the lovely shores of the bay. Ships had sailed up and down the St. Lawrence for centuries past its virgin forests, but no one stopped there except a few adventurous hunters and prospectors. Here in this forest community live the men who have built and are maintaining a development that is the last word in papermaking. Here they make their homes. Far from the centers of civilization, they raise their families. Like the pioneers of old, they're self-reliant and progressive. These men are skilled craftsmen whose keenness and interest in their work ensures the production of high-class newsprint. Baie-Comeau is now a model city. The workers live in homes that are their pride. For attractiveness, these homes could compete with the best that any city could offer. What is more, the people of Baie-Comeau have a spiritual wealth as fine as one can get in a city community. The towers of the Catholic Church rear up into the sky, a symbol of spiritual comfort. Though far from the centers of population, the educational facilities for children are equal to, if not better than, those of the cities. In summertime, the swimming pool is the mecca of most of the children of the community. The hospital at Baie-Comeau is so well staffed and equipped that the citizens have no fears of illness here in the wilderness. Modern police and fire protection ensure the security of the people. For visitors, Manoir Como is a quiet, picturesque hotel that vies with the best for service and hospitality. All Baie-Comeau is as proud of the mayor's garden as is the mayor himself. It is a colorful paradise set in the middle of the green forests of northern Quebec. The community center is the focal point for relaxation. There are rooms for dancing or quiet reading, a well-stocked circulating library, community singing, skating, and curling, billiards and bowling are but a few of the activities the people of this community share and enjoy. This, then, is Baie-Comeau, a modern community of over 2,000 people. All work for the paper mill and for each other. Their solitude knits them closer together than is possible in a city. Their livelihood depends on the maintenance of a democratic press. Theirs is a service that provides for the enlightenment of the people. And that's the story of Baie-Comeau, the production of high-quality, low-cost newsprint in the world's most efficient newsprint mill.